The sun had withered every living thing except the salt bush. The people had weathered, their skins contracting and their eyes sinking as their stock became white bones. But they stayed in the wooden homes because they believed the rain would fall sometime. This image comes towards the end of Wake in Fright, perhaps the most menacing novel ever written from an Australian context. The story's protagonist, John Grant, stumbles his way back across the desert scrub of the fictional town of Bundinyaba, seeking shelter. Exhausted, he is assaulted by the sun, by the space, by the desolation, and by what he's found over the course of the 6 weeks that he's spent waylaid in the interior of Australia. In this country of the inland, everything cries out for water and the absolution and vindication that may be offered by rain. But this water never comes. The inland instead remains an inhospitable emptiness, the dead heart of so-called Australia. As Rosalind Haynes has written at the centre of the continent, the most alarming prospect faced by the inland explorers, coming from the confines of heavily populated Britain and Europe, was that of void. This was particularly true of the desert, with its repeated vistas of empty horizontal plains under a cloudless, overarching sky. It therefore seems paradoxical that this vast expanse of apparently empty space was so frequently described in their accounts in Gothic terms of enclosure and entrapment. Indeed, it was the very emptiness of the desert, as seen through European eyes, that led the explorers to people it with ghosts. In our presentation for you today, we present a speculative engagement with the ghost, that original spectre that has haunted the Australian continent for thousands of years, water. And in doing so, we present a tentative case for the Eromanga Sea as foundational within the context of the Australian Gothic, and particularly within the context of a coastal Gothic. So to provide some historical background, the Eromanga Sea was a shallow epieric waterway that once covered most of inland Australia. As Australia separated from the Antarctic landmass, a portion of the Australian continent was lowered by as much as 350 metres. With this lowering came the inward creep of the ocean, known now as the Eromanga Sea. Peaking in size between 110 and 115 million years ago, the Eromanga supported a large and diverse ecosystem, home to a plethora of prehistoric species. But the Eromanga began to slowly fill with sediment, with large sections of it drying out as it was cut off from the rivers that had initially fed it. Over time, this sedimentation allowed the formation of the Great Artesian Basin, one of the largest underground freshwater reservoirs in the world. With the disappearance of the sea came the disappearance of those species dependent upon it for their survival. Aquatic dinosaurs, such as plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, ammonites and chronosaurs, the remnants of which can still be found as fossils and opals. Theories suggest that the extinction of megafauna on the continent is also tied to the disappearance of these inland bodies of water. We believe that the Eromanga seeps across and flows within a number of Gothic frames, those of the Eco-Gothic, Australian Gothic, and Coastal Gothic. We believe also, however, that the Australian Gothic is primarily an Eco-Gothic framework, just one that is attuned to the distinctive ecologies of the Australian landmass. As Ken Gelder writes, the Australian Gothic has its origin in the Freudian unheimlich, an unfamiliar, inaccessible, unhomely situational locatedness. This is manifest in the early colonial attitudes to the continent. As Jerry Turcott writes, the Australian Gothic emerges from a framing which sees Australia as a world of reversals, the dark subconscious of Britain. It was, for all intents and purposes, Gothic par excellence, the dungeon of the world. Turcott's landmark article, written in 1998, lays out some familiar cliches. Its trees shed their bark, swans were black rather than white, and the seasons were reversed. And while these features represented a physical perversion, it was widely considered to be metonymic of an attendant spiritual disease. This spiritual disease emanated from the colonists, the physical perversion and projection upon the land, with these recurring Gothic motifs a useful tool to emphasize the horror, uncertainty, and desperation of the human experience. The new home suddenly unhomely, and the overwhelming sense that something was and continues to be not right. But this uneasy reading of the country was supported by catastrophic excursions into the interior and the ready failure of agricultural and pastoral enterprises in the early days of the colony. This unease was interpreted as the country betraying them, anthropomorphized and trying to shake them off, rather than their misreading of the natural itself. The continued deployment of these tropes and the persistence of the Australian Gothic within Australian culture and the arts suggests that there is still a sense of unease as it relates to the place of people of European descent amidst the Australian continent, the reverberation of a very tangible sense of trespass that accompanied the initial invasion and dispossession.
The early incarnations of the Australian Gothic served to transpose Gothic sensibilities upon an Australian context. Over time, however, a distinctive form of the Gothic has emerged. Our decision to introduce this presentation with Wake in Fright is due to its significance within the Australian Gothic canon. Whilst Wake in Fright is still attuned to those traditional tropes of the Gothic, it exchanges the dreary gloom of the bush, the strange scribblings of nature learning how to write, for the blinding light and heat of the desert. The entirety of the continent has become Gothicized. The dry, dead heart of the country is menacing as the gloomy, damp fears of the mist, moors, and mountains. Contextualizing this through the Eromanga Sea, we envision the whole country turned coast. The littoral thickened, but remaining a band separating the outward sea from the inner. In such a figuration, it becomes possible to overlay further a coastal Gothic onto this band, which, as theorized by Linda Hoyoluk, emerges as a nervous duality in which the isolation of the littoral site, which correlates to the isolation of the desert, reverberates with mania, fear, and horror. The spectre of an inland sea haunts not only the landscapes of Australia, but early conceptions of the landmass made by European invaders seeking to map and contain what they so wrongly perceived to be an endless void. In reflecting upon the mindset of the colonizers, Haynes identified that through their journals, letters, and archives, the invaders as explorers supplied a vocabulary for translating the desert into a nightmarish landscape, within which the deepest fears of the European colonists, isolation in an alien land, drought and thirst hitherto unimaginable, and the fear of a lonely death far from home, could be encoded, identified, and confronted. From the earliest days of invasion, the mysteries of the inland were tied to the myth of an inner wellspring. A hypothesis that following the rivers from the outer shore would soon lead to a vast interior inland reservoir. Instructions given to Matthew Flinders in the late 1700s emphasized the criticality of following the flows for the British, with the order being given that in case you should discover any creek or opening likely to lead to an inland sea or strait, you are at liberty to examine it. However, the first inroads from the external coast toward the mirage of an inner shore began with the crossing of the Great Dividing Range by Gregory Blackland in 1813, and this revealed many rivers, but no sea. Rather than discouraging their efforts, however, they continued westward and further inland, doubling down on the belief that a great expanse of water lay beyond the horizon, just out of view. The search for an inland sea claimed many lives. The harsh landscape was unforgiving to the trespassers who, ill-suited to the extremes of the interior, were tested by thirst, starvation, illness, and poor navigation. Some simply disappeared, as was the case of Ludwig Leichhardt, who vanished somewhere west of the Darling Downs in 1848. Perhaps the most well-known exploratory failure is that of Burke and Wills, who succumbed to malnourishment and exhaustion on the isolated bank of Cooper Creek in 1861. As identified by Glenn Morrison, the parched failure of these early invaders is tied to the formation of Australian cultural identity. He states that dying of thirst is a spectre that haunts our culture, the legacy of the explorers, Ayres struggling on parched and desperate for water on his trek along the Great Australian Bight, Sturt and his party marooned at Depot Glen by drought, which ultimately forced them to retreat, Lassiter dying, according to rumour, within a short distance of his alleged gold reef. Of those men lost in the interior, there is one figure who looms across the historical landscape, Charles Sturt, British officer, explorer, and fool whose dogged search for the inland sea ultimately led to his demise. Not one of the three expeditions he made into inland Australia met with any success. The first, departing from Wellington, New South Wales in 1828, set out to explore the Macquarie River area to the west and hitherto unknown. While they would survive this journey, it was unsuccessful, serving only to deepen the mystery of where the waters went. Sturt's second expedition was approved in November of the following year, and in January 1830 his party set off down the Murrumbidgee River. So confident were they of success in their endeavour that Sturt wrote to Hamilton Hume, fellow explorer, on the 4th of January 1830, "Where I shall wander to, God only knows. I have little doubt, however, that I shall make the coast." In a display of similar confidence, Sturt's party dragged with them a disassembled whaleboat. But owing to the nature of the country, their plans to travel by foot were quickly abandoned, the whaleboat assembled, and sail set. A second boat, constructed from felled trees, sank within a week, spoiling much of the party's supplies. Nevertheless, they pushed on, the expedition reaching the Murray River, following this to the Darling River, before changing course, returning to the Murray, and following its course eventually to Lake Alexandrina. Disembarking and walking across the sand hills to where the river slowly leached out to sea, they were dismayed to find this channel impassable for shipping. The group was now left in a perilous condition, forced to row back against the current to Sydney in the middle of summer. This journey, lasting from the 12th of February to the 25th of May, nearly destroyed the party. Although starving and weak from exhaustion, they survived. Sturt fared far worse than the others, going blind for several months and never fully recovering his health. While this journey was unsuccessful, it piqued the interest of the colonists. Sturt wrote of the Murray Valley, "It contains land that is of the very richest kind, soil that is the pure accumulation of vegetable matter, and is as black as ebony. Were this practically available, he would have encouraged the flow of people westward. But similarly, Sturt remarks of the red high cliffs and fossil beds, their existence must be the result of a large current of water. This, combined with the discovery of what Governor Darling referred to as beyond all comparison the most important that has ever been made in this colony, a water communication having been discovered from the settled districts to Encounter Bay on the south coast, served to bolster Sturt's conviction that it was his destiny to locate a great saltwater lake in the middle of Australia, lest his bones blanch in the desert. His third expedition was to be his final one. Heading north from Adelaide, his party set off in August of 1844, unaware of the troubles that lay before them. Judging from the correspondence that exists, their outward journey was relatively calm compared to the tumult of the last expedition. This maintained as they pushed along the Murray, but at the confluence with the Darling, which Sturt had visited before, their fortunes took a turn for the worse. As the hills gave way to flat and stony plains, they pushed on, clinging desperately to any sign that they were on the right track. Their persistence led them into a trap of heat and thirst. Sheltering for 6 months at a location later deemed Depot Glen, discontent within the party began to fester. Breaking out from what in hindsight could be considered an oasis, and detachment from the party set out heading north into the blistering heat of the outback. Another campsite was established. Sturt and one other, a boy named Joseph Cowley, pressed on. Sturt certain that his vast inland sea lay at the 28th parallel. When they arrived, however, all that lay before them was emptiness. Sturt later wrote that he felt as though he and Cowley were the last of the human race left to witness the destruction of our planet. If only he knew the role he was to play in that process. Returning to Depot Glen, the remainder of the party tried to venture further, staying at Fort Grey, a campsite used on their trip out. Eventually, however, they conceded defeat and returned to Adelaide, their spirits and bodies broken, arriving in January 1846, 18 months after they set out. Sturt's body was ruined. After succumbing to scurvy, he returned to England. It was not until 1858 that he finally gives up on the idea of an inland sea, following Augustus Gregory's expedition from the north of the continent, and his entry into the same desert where Sturt turned back, having entered it from the south. Having never fully recovered from his trials, Sturt passed away suddenly in 1869.
In the riding over of the landscape over the journeys of these ill-fated invaders, the perceived lack of the interior is seen to draw to the surface the subconscious dread of a void within, which has infused figurations of colonial Australian identity with a particular attunement to this presence of the Gothic. The centre as void unfurls in this specific frame. The construction of an Australian Gothic, and a particular interior Gothic, emerges from haunting, harm, and desolation, violence of the landscape turned upon the explorer. However, this narrative belies the true horrors of massacre and dispossession which swept across the interior due to the legal fiction of terra nullius, the harms perpetrated by the invaders upon the indigenous peoples of so-called Australia. The Australian Gothic, which sees the continent figured as a dark subconscious of Britain, wrote over the agency of indigenous Australians, their lives, history, and connection to country absorbed into a Gothicizing of indigeneity, written over in favour of a framing which rewrites Aboriginal past and present as that which stands outside of and that which is to be feared. These perceptions of an interior emptiness and a dark half to the light of Europe erase the vibrancy of the interior, which, whilst harsh, has sustained human life for more than 40,000 years, and other than human life for millennia. The creeping fear of an Australian Gothic paints the landscape as monstrous, with the harsh interior formulated, in the words of Ross Gibson, as the Badlands, a place contemptuous of those who seek to traverse it, and land resisting colonial ambition. The interior then becomes a site in which violence begins to seem natural, obscuring the violence of the colonizer which is overwritten place. In traipsing across the history of the search for an inland sea, we return once more to the Eromanga. Through this presentation, we've offered the disappearance of the Eromanga as a foundational event within the framework of an Australian Gothic, and two within a coastal Gothic framework. In repositioning the continent as it existed in the time of the Eromanga, as a land comprised solely of coastline, we acknowledge how this acts to intensify the isolation and distance that has informed Australian identity, and as such, serves to amplify the accompanying historical and contemporary unsettling. But further, in the face of broad and rapid climate change, and as successive waves of drought sweep the interior, we see amplified that which is missing, and has been missing for millennia, leaving us adrift on a Gothic sea, invisible but deeply effective.